Right, yeah, this is so yeah, Aurelia is a good friend of mine. We've been a part of the like game AI community for since I guess like around 2016 in my case. Well, he actually precedes me in that regard. He's a assistant professor at the University of Utah at the Entertainment Arts and Engineering newly formed department.
Yeah, it'll be effective July.
Awesome. Which is all very exciting. And yeah, he has a lot of really admirable scholarship on the intersection between narrative design and game design and cognitive science. We've written some papers together about the cognitive psychology of reading comics. And he won a career award, which is super great. And I don't know, what else is awesome about you?
Puerto Rican.
He's Puerto Rican. Very cool.
I think it's pretty awesome.
I think that's pretty cool too. All right, I think maybe that's all I've got for an introduction. You're good, but
I gotta wait for Emma.
okay, we still gotta wait for Emma, so either awkward silence or someone say something amusing.
I always wish I had like jokes at the cuff ready to go. Like,
Yeah.
oh, let me actually move this screen out of the way. Actually.
Glad you made it, Daijin. Oh, hello.
I'll be sad if you got over there and the room was empty.
There were not a lot of students left.
They were there, there were like 10 students and they had food and they were in the middle of like studying.
We were over there for a few minutes. There were only like 3 or something like once we were there, but I don't know if they didn't look like the same people who were in your game studio class. They looked like a different crowd.
There's
Okay.
not my students.
Okay,
Because my control of the room ended last week.
got it.
And
Okay.
so this week it was probably random students who had.
I see. You're saying you'd be sad if they left because then we could have just gone there. Okay, yeah, that's fine. I think this is a good crowd for the room. All right.
Cool.
I'm gonna move out of the way and start presenting.
I'm going to unmute. I'm going to mute that and then unmute myself.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Oh, okay.
Oh, you probably also want to turn the sound off.
I'm muted. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Rogelio, as Chris mentioned, and I'm really excited to be here. Thank you all for having me, for hosting me. I'm here to talk about two things that I get really excited about: games and narrative. And hopefully keeping on theme, I guess, with the other talks that have been part of the speaker series this year, really diving into how to make these work well with each other. Very quickly, I just want to give a very brief shout out to my collaborators, my colleagues, my funding sources, without which this literally would not have been possible. So thank you all very much. Okay, so whenever academics get into a group of other academics and start talking about games and narrative, there is usually a kind of defense of story games in trying to make them work. This harkens back to earlier debates on like ludology versus narratology, or perhaps Ian Bogost's article in The Atlantic, video games are better without stories. I want to just jump the gun here and say that this is not that kind of a discussion. This is not that kind of talk. And in fact, if you will forgive the conceit, I will offer perhaps an incendiary statement that if you believe in it, I think will make actually these takes somewhat irrelevant. And that's that all games tell stories, with the caveat that some are more intended than others. And to kind of really hearken, or really like hone in on this point, I'm going to use one of the top games that involve stories of all time, Super Mario Brothers, which you may be familiar with. So when I say this, people don't take me seriously that Super Mario Brothers is actually a story game of sorts. But in fact, if you go all the way to the end, Princess Toadstool literally tells you that your quest is over at the end. And if you are not familiar with the term quest, you should know that there is a ton of literature about quests and quest design, and that quests feature prominently as an element of literary fiction, specifically like fantasy fiction. If you don't believe me that it's sufficiently narratively driven, you can also take a look at the box art for Mario Brothers, which asks you very specifically, do you have what it takes to save the Mushroom Princess? And so I'm going to build on this argument to really talk about why all games tell stories. Now, historically, when I get to this point of the talk, there is usually someone in the audience that goes something like this. Is like, wait a second. So what's the story behind Tetris? It's usually the first challenge.
I was thinking Breakout, but
Oh, Breakout, sure. Tetris is good, maybe proxy for Breakout, modulo certain caveats. So depending on who you ask, like what the story of Tetris is, it could be the story of US American life, and that actually was a take by Janet Murray, who wrote Hamlet on the Holodeck. If you ask Ralph Koster, it's Bodies in a Mass Grave. Now, the question that I always kind of pose back at folks like this is, like, are these intended? And there are many arguments for death of the author and all that, but really what I'm honing in on is, what evidence do we have that this is the narrative that is, I guess, intended on the designer side to be transmitted to the audience? And really, there is not a lot to go on. I would also say that in addition to no, I guess, inspectable evidence for these takes or these interpretations of stories, I will also note that in a sense, story cognition is overburdened. And by that, I mean, it takes a lot of deliberate effort to make sense of Tetris as the story of US American life or as Bodies in a Mass Grave, in that you really do have to engage your cognitive faculties to read into something in the framework of a story. Now, the rest of the presentation will take seriously the following question, which is, how could we design it to elicit those interpretations? And by that, I mean both facilitate an intended interpretation, so facilitate one of these, or possibly others, and just as importantly, impede an unintended interpretation. So it's about constraining the space of interpretations that a specific artifact can elicit in the mind of an audience. And with that said, I want to talk about how GFI, this thing that I've co-invented, helps or might help you do something like that. Today's objective as a presentation, I really want to hone in on the point. GFI, I would argue, makes sense of narrative game design as a practice. And in these 3 points, I hope to convince you of that statement. Number one, I want to talk about specifically what is GFI, and then hopefully argue convincingly why you need it, and finally, how you might use it in your narrative game design practice. All right, because this is a more intimate gathering, I'm more than happy to go off script. So what questions do we have so far, if any?
The one I have is the one, sorry, you first.
Oh, just, you may also want to pay attention to the chat on Zoom.
Oh, yes, legitimately. Yes, there is someone. Let me also go ahead. Okay, so now I have chat in front of me. All these windows.
Log into Zoom and set turn my microphone off so I can help with filtering chat.
That might be good. I also, well, I need to potentially let people into the from the waiting room.
Mhm.
Oh, no.
Figure out. Okay.
No worries at all.
Waiting rooms are terrible. So I have all kinds of questions, but I can't.
Oh, that's exciting.
Not dominate the conversation.
Oh, I will stop. I will stop you in your tracks.
Mainly, I would just say that I'm very much on your side and have this conversation a lot with students.
Right.
And a lot of it is focuses around games as procedural rhetoric and the fact that, you know, game mechanic verbs are narrative verbs, and that the player's participating in some form of rhetorical argument. And so, like, you can look at what is the intentional or unintentional argument made by this game. And for something like Tetris, the fact that the game doesn't end, the fact that the game gets gradually faster, the fact that your main gameplay loop of clear lines is something that is essentially futile and never ending, makes it a strong metaphor for capitalist society. If I wanted to do that intentionally, I would have your score increase when you clear lines and decrease each time you buy a new piece, and make it such that that always, is essentially a zero-sum process, so that your score doesn't increase over time. I wouldn't try putting in more explicit narrative because that's not what the game is good at.
Yeah, that's totally fair. So part of the impetus for even inventing the GFI framework was to get at the tangibly, what do I have to do to get at these intended or unintended narratives, rhetorics. Hopefully I'll unpack some of that in the talk, and if we still have questions about that, I definitely can come back to it. But good to know that I'm in good company, so to speak. Yeah.
So it's a little adjacent to that, not really. It's closer to, I was thinking about the Tetris and the breakouts.
Sure.
When we talk about story, do we mean specifically the story that the final product is trying to communicate, or could we get a little meta with it? Like with breakout, some of the story is, look at how simple this is. This was built in a time where computers were very simplistic and didn't have a lot of processing power, and someone wanted to make a game. That's a story. But when we're talking about story, where's our scope is my question, basically.
That's a fair question. So the question was, when we're talking about story, where do we draw the line? What is our scope that we're talking about? So I will answer compactly, and hopefully the rest of the presentation will dovetail into it. But in my argument, the story is whatever manifests inside your mind.
Okay.
And different things can contribute positively or negatively to that specific interpretation. So ultimately, the narrative is in the interpretation, which is the I of GFI. And we'll get to that.
Got it.
Okay, so dovetailing. So I have a question in chat before I continue. I have a question about whether divinatory games are in scope. Would like to hold it until later. Okay, so please hold on to it. And if I don't get to it, then remind me, but I don't see why not. All right.
Could you repeat that word? 'Cause I didn't quite-
Divinatory. I don't know if I'm saying it correctly.
Yeah, that's like divination.
I believe so. Yes.
So games played with tarot cards.
Got it. Thank you.
Right. Okay, great. So let's go into the first point. What is GFI? So upfront, GFI, goals, feedback, and interpretation. And to not bury the lead, I will just tell you what these are as definitions, and I'll explain all of them by way of a long-running example building on the Mario Brothers case. So goals, feedback, and interpretation, I argue that they are three additional pillars of game design. And by additional, what am I adding to? Dovetailing into game design practice, I would argue, and we can have a debate about this, that to date, MDA is the dominant technical language with which we talk about games. There are variants of this and alternative competing frameworks, but I have not found as widespread recognition or support or use of another framework, much like MDA. So MDA stands for mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. The idea being that as designers, we are more on the manipulation of the mechanics side of things, which roughly speaking correspond to the rules of the game. The dynamics are the embodiment of the system, how the system basically plays with the rules and the inputs by the player. And on the far end, which is more player facing and not less designer facing, is the game aesthetic, or the so-called fun of the game. And aesthetics is also unfortunately named because it doesn't mean what aesthetics means in art critique, but it is the language with which we're going to work with because we've inherited it. So bear with me. All right, so in kind of making sense of these at a high level, you can think of mechanics being ultimately how you can act, dynamics being how the system reacts, roughly speaking, and aesthetics, roughly speaking, how you feel or what the game elicits in the act of gameplay. These are surprisingly very slippery to get, to get any kind of agreement on. In fact, a recent paper that I published really tried to give like technical definitions for what these are. And for the sake of this talk, let's just agree to my terms, because that's what I'm going to build on. So mechanics, or what I mean by that, in thinking about games at the level of game code, you can think of the mechanics as the available states and transitions that can manifest inside a specific game. So we are currently in a snapshot state of the world with Mario that is in the air, with Bowser having hurled a fireball from right to left. There is a platform above Mario at some pixel distance. There is what seems to be an axe at the very end. In essence, the current state, the possible states we can get to, and how we can go from one state to the other define the mechanics space of the game. The dynamics ultimately is the new states that can result from the transitions. So in more technical terms, you can think of it as the state transition function. So what tells you what state you get to, given the state that you're in and the transition that you've elected or not. And then finally, because I can't get more specific than the typology that they actually published, so aesthetics is really one of 8 possible that are elicited in players. So they provide in the paper on MDA the typology of game aesthetics, so what the game evokes in players. And if you've never seen these, I'll just quickly summarize them. The game could evoke sensory pleasure, so just the sensation that you feel of being inside a virtual world. It could be a sense of fantasy. Arguably, this is the closest link to narrative overtly in the aesthetics. A sense of drama, well, actually, fantasy and drama, both closely linked to narrative. A sense of challenge, that the game is basically challenging you to compete or to accomplish something in the virtual world. A sense of fellowship or camaraderie that you might feel with other people inside the virtual space, a sense of discovery or you wanting to explore undiscovered lands, a sense of expression. It is a vehicle through which you can manifest your personality or your personness. And finally, a sense of leisure or pastime that might be elicited through the act of play. And according to the original paper, it's one of these 8 is like the dominant one, and then you can have multiple ones that kind of like stack, but usually there is one overriding sense of what the game aesthetic is.
Can I pause for a second?
Sure. Yeah. What's up?
Okay. I wanted to go back to actually the previous slide, the one where you're defining the other
This one?
keywords, even though maybe this isn't, maybe you're not building on this as much, but
Sure.
just as a nitpick, right? Some of the, or one of the places that people like, try to pick apart the terms here in terms of definitions of MDA is whether mechanics includes the actions of the game world rather than just what the player can do.
Mhm.
And it sounds like by your technical definition of like available states and transitions, you are including those things, but this kind of like more, more like, what am I trying to say? Like more casual way of phrasing it, how you can act. The you here I was interpreting here to be the player. So yeah, I guess which one do you mean?
That's a fair question. So the question is, what am I actually referring to with my use of mechanics in my description here of saying how you can act, when in the previous slides I described them or defined them as available states and transitions, which might admit the game's moves. Yeah, that's fair. So I am very much trying to cheekily summarize how you can act, because usually when we talk about mechanics, kind of just in the casual conversation of game design, we are honing into what the players can actually act with. I would say that the precise definition is that mechanics are ultimately the state, like the set of states and transitions accessible to the player, but that the broader set of states and transitions are also might be actionable by the game. So there is, out of all the set of states and transitions, some are game specific, some are player specific, and the player ones are the mechanics.
So is like, for example, in Tetris, do you consider like gravity acting on the pieces to make them fall? Do you consider that to be a mechanic, or would that fit into dynamics?
In both, because you can accelerate the piece from falling down. So
Okay, so that part would be a mechanic.
that part would be a mechanic for me, correct?
Gotcha. All right.
Yep, thank you. All right. So in looking at this, like, oh, sorry.
Is that not be relevant? And I'm not coming at this from the perspective of games, so
Great.
I may not be quite following, but like, how do you like determine the time tick of analyzing between points?
That is an excellent question, and which I don't have time to answer, but this is a great follow-up conversation offline. The paper that I introduced the technical terms for mechanics, dynamics, and well, not aesthetics, but mechanics and dynamics goes into this point.
Okay, I have a second question.
Yes.
I don't recall the definition for sensation. Can you?
Oh, yeah. So when the game evokes a kind of sensory pleasure to a player, so it is a visually appealing experience, or it is like a harmonious blending of visual and audio, for example.
So does it take it in different modalities, like someone, doing like DDR and Guitar Hero type stuff?
Yes, it would admit that. Yeah.
And presumably not just pleasurable sensation. If I'm playing a horror game that's making me intensely uncomfortable, and that's the point of it, and it's succeeding in doing that, then that's sensation.
Right. Yes. So the sensory pleasure need not always be of positive affect, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. I think there's a lot of assumptions in this early game literature, like the MDA paper, that the feelings you're trying to evoke in players are always good.
Yeah.
And that's of course not true.
Yes.
So it might be closer to like sensory gratification if you're trying to fulfill something.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Eliciting sensory effects.
Yes. Yeah. I think eliciting sensory effects would be the definition I'm comfortable with.
And for people who haven't been around since this paper was published, like it's a really seminal and widely understood paper. It's very dated. It's still useful in terms of beginning your scaffolding of understanding games, but it's also 20 odd years old thinking. And so like but we also haven't come up with something definitively better, but we've come up with a lot of things that are wrong with this.
Yes.
Lots of critiques, few proposed alternatives.
Right.
Indeed.
I may have written a book, so.
Yeah.
Is this work rooted in like psychology or?
Is which work rooted? This
The
one?
MDA paper.
Yeah.
Not to
No.
my knowledge.
So is it, where does this typology of aesthetics come from?
Excellent question.
Design was Haneke's background. I mean, she was a computer scientist, and I don't know what background her other collaborators had, but I don't know. Sorry, I should let you.
That's fine. So I will let those questions be unanswered, and we should maybe invite the authors to give talks.
One more question. Are there going to be links to some of these or any way?
Oh, I will make all these slides available. Thanks.
Yeah, and I will propagate it to the same places that I propagated.
Because I want to see if you want to grab it.
Sure. So with MDA being the dominant technical language, one thing that was deeply unsatisfying from my perspective is that in essence, there are several gaps that it leaves unaddressed or open. In specific, there was no obvious way, or there is no obvious way to account for narrative design needs. And people have tried to make it work, but to give you a sense of where the MDA falls short of describing something that I really care about, take, for example, the game Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. So at the onset of the game, you are presented with a variety of cutscenes where you are setting up, in essence, the backstory of this character who is coming back to a model city of Los Angeles from a model city of New York City. And as they kind of jump back into the fray, they encounter all kinds of family-oriented drama. One of the first things that you do as a player, or you're prompted to do as a player, is this scene where you actually get the instructions: hop on a bicycle and follow suite, repeatedly tapping X to build up momentum. So that's like the prompt that you get at the onset. And it's really interesting because part of this prompt speaks to the narrative element, part of the prompt speaks to the game element, right? So repeatedly tapping X. And so there's a duality of story and gameplay that makes these things difficult to understand if you aren't already immersed in the culture and know how to parse this as a sentence. Because it is not an obvious way to go about it. And it doesn't fully reside in the aspect of the mechanics, right? So the mechanics arguably are linked to repeatedly tapping X, but to build up momentum, that is a specific goal that is like presented to you as a desirable thing. Hop on a bicycle and follow suit. I mean, that also speaks to the narrative side of things. And that's a goal not necessarily on the game side, but on the narrative side. And this is very cumbersome to explain or really make sense of if we don't have additional language to latch onto. So this is kind of like one of the initial motivations behind the GFI framework. Okay, so again, not to bury the lead, to kind of contrast the mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. And again, these are very cheeky summaries that we'll dive into in the rest of the paper, in the rest of the talk. The goals are why you would want to act. So mechanics are how you can act, and goals are why you would want to. Feedback is how you would know about goals and about the dynamics, about how the system reacts to you. And interpretation is why you feel the way you feel. Now, these will be discussed in much more depth throughout, but just to give you the punchline up front. Okay, so I said these are 3 additional pillars of game design, and now we're going to dive into the actual framework itself: goals, feedback, and interpretation. So up front, goals, conditions you're expected to meet to succeed at the game; feedback, multimodal stimuli that communicates game elements; and finally, interpretation, which is both the process of deriving meaning. So I am engaging in an act of interpretation, and I also have an interpretation at the end. So it's both the process and product of the cognitive engagement here. Okay, so these are all definitions that are going to make much more sense by way of an example, applying it to Super Mario Brothers. All right. Coming back to the end of Super Mario Brothers, how I'm going to start discussing this framework. In essence, when you get to this point, I can ask the question, well, how do you accomplish that? And this is I mean, it's non-rhetorical, but it's rhetorical if no one answers. How do you accomplish that? This is a question for the audience.
How do you accomplish
that
getting
end?
to there?
That end. Beat a bunch of levels.
Eliminate all the castles in which the princess is not.
Yeah.
Beat the final boss.
Beat the final boss most immediately. How do you accomplish that is by defeating Bowser.
I just like to note this comes from I fenced for a couple of years when I was young, and my fencing coach used to say, "How many points does it take to win a match?" And I would say 5. And he'd say, "No, 1, the last one."
The last one.
Yeah.
That's fair. That's totally fair. I very much appreciate that method. So by asking the question, how do you accomplish that? We're going to reveal a lot of hidden complexity behind the goal structure of Mario Brothers. So by asking the question, how do you accomplish that? The first thing that I'm going to answer with is by finishing Super Mario Brothers. Now, this finish, Super Mario Brothers, I'm using it as a technical term because the GFI framework says all games have, at their culmination, an ultimate goal.
Tetris?
To prolong. So there are 3 kinds of in-game conditions that players will need to meet to succeed at the game. So you can win, as in soccer, where there is, in essence, upon reaching a specific state of the game, there is an evaluation to determine who wins and who loses. You can, in contrast, finish, like Mario Brothers, in which no such evaluation to determine winners or losers happens. And finally, prolonging, in which gameplay concludes against intent. So in DayZ, you in essence have to survive as long as you can until you are eventually overrun. In Tetris, you are in essence playing to prolong your play, but the gameplay will conclude against your intent.
What's the ultimate goal in the AI dungeon?
What is the ultimate goal in AI Dungeon? Great question. What is the ultimate goal in AI Dungeon?
What is AI Dungeon?
AI Dungeon is well, I don't remember what version of the AI system.
Ran on at least GPT-3.
Some version of GPT powered text adventure game.
Or Minecraft pre the Ender Dragon.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, that's an excellent one. So ultimate goals speak to goals that are codified on behalf of designers for the experience. So in the case of AI Dungeon, which isn't necessarily crafted for any overt purpose in mind, that would then fall into the realm of player-directed goals, akin to something like speed running, right? So in speed running, you play as quickly as possible without regard to the actual like mechanic structure of the game. And in essence, the game doesn't care whether you speedrun it or not. Similar to this case of AI Dungeon. That's a great question, though.
So the game doesn't, so this is, you were talking earlier about narrative and what the narrative is intended by the author or not.
Mhm.
In the case of goals also, goals don't need to be intended by the game's creator. In fact, the game's creator may have a goal that is not the goal of a particular player in the game.
That is correct. And that speaks to one overt limitation of this framework I can only really concretely talk about here: designer crafted goals, right? So any player derived goals, that falls out of scope of the kinds of goals that I'm going to be talking about here. These are goals that are, in essence, recognized or acknowledged by the game in some overt way.
Sure. I think that in games where there are player-defined goals, there's a distinct difference between games where the player is subverting the game by designing goals and where the game has intentionally made a variety of goals possible, and the player is using the game's systems to decide to pursue one of those.
Right, and so the fine line that I'm drawing here is: are the goals structurally acknowledged by the game in some way?
Okay.
And there is some signaling to that effect. Yeah.
So the difference might be, for example, within Minecraft, to use a pretty clear-cut example, you could set a goal of, I want to make the biggest fort, or I want to kill as many creepers as possible. I have not actually played Minecraft.
Sure.
I just have, but the actual in-game goal that allows you a finished condition is defeat the dragon.
Right. Correct. Yes.
Although the game existed for a solid decade before that was part of the game.
Correct. But yes, but in the story mode that you're talking about, yeah. Okay. So we can recursively ask that question. How do you accomplish that? Beneath the ultimate goals, by asking the question, we get to a second class of goals, which we call the imperative ones. So in essence, imperative goals, in here, I've kind of written out, kind of like in programmatic text, like remove, in essence, the token B1, which we will recognize as maybe Bowser. Imperative goals defined are closer to gameplay conditions that players need to meet to accomplish the ultimate. So the one that directly entails the ultimate is known as the proximate imperative, but every imperative kind of beneath that, in essence, is subservient to the superordinate goal. We argue that there are exactly 10 types, and I would love to be challenged on this. The reason for this argument is through inductive analysis of over 30 games. I think we had like 37 games, and we tried to, in essence, map from a variety of genres and come up with the most compact typology that could make sense of the diverse goal structures out there. So one can optimize their standing, like in Mario Kart, for the pole position. One can reach platforms, as in Celeste. One can remove elements from gameplay, as in Bowser from Mario Brothers. One can attempt to, wait a second, I've lost focus. Oh, someone I think is trying to join.
You need to click like some buttons.
I got it.
Oh, thank you. No worries. You can solve, which is selecting an element from a very, very large set or perceptually infinite set, like when you're trying to accuse someone in the game Clue. You can synchronize game elements in space and time, like Beat Saber. You can choose an element from a set, as in options in Boyfriend Dungeon. You can configure or manipulate elements into a correct state, such as puzzles in The Room. You can create elements, such as when you're crafting things in Minecraft. You can find elements for which you don't know their current location, like when you're playing hide and seek. And you can obtain elements, which is kind of like find, but really you're placing them under your control, as in Halo Capture the Flag. Yes?
Yeah, I mean, this kind of probably is built in, but is it safe to presume that these goals can feed into each other?
Absolutely. Yes.
Like you can obtain something to solve something.
Absolutely,
you can
yes.
Configure something to remove something.
Definitely, yes. So to repeat the question, is it possible that you can compose or like feed into each other these goal structures? Absolutely, yes, you can. The earlier question of how do you accomplish that is meant to be asked literally. So by asking the question, how do you accomplish that, you can reveal subordinate goals to the superordinate. Chris, you had your hand in.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious. So what I was intrigued by kind of from the beginning of your talk, like seems to be showing up again here, which is this kind of idea of like we've been like this example of like press X to get on the bike or whatever it was, like where there's like a conflation of the kind of like extra diegetic things that you're doing with the things that you're doing in the game world, which are representational of something. Like getting on the bike is not something that you're like doing as an action. You're not like you press a button on the controller and that's at a different level of abstraction than like your character gets on the bike. And these verbs all seem to be, I guess, like they all seem to be sort of in the representational level, right? Is that, yeah, you're smiling, so I'm guessing that that's on purpose. And I find myself a little bit, I guess, surprised, but maybe I shouldn't be. I don't know. Mostly that's just an observation. Can you comment?
Absolutely. So the observation is, wait a second, these verbs that we're using to describe imperative goals themselves have this kind of like narrative ascription to them.
Right,
and so what are we really getting at here?
Right. Like, couldn't you realize, like, given that I can realize the idea of finding something with many different operational logics, like navigating to a room and pressing, examine whatever in a text adventure game versus like doing a pixel hunt and clicking on something in an image versus, I don't know, moving my avatar around the screen until I line up with something, and that could represent finding something.
Correct.
Right. Like, is there, is that okay? Is there a case where these lines get kind of fuzzy because some of the sort of extra diegetic ways that we operationalize these narrative verbs like could be interpreted in multiple different ways potentially.
Right.
Define the word or diegetic.
Okay, diegetic means like takes place within the story world of the game. Extra diegetic means like is something that the player understands himself to be doing as a player, but not as the character.
Okay, so a really good example of this, to step out of the medium for a second, is musicals. The characters can't hear the songs, right?
Yes.
Songs are
Right.
not diegetic. Yeah. Whereas, like, if they put a song on the radio in the movie, they can hear that song. It's diegetic.
So the slipperiness of language here was one of the difficulties in trying to establish the typology in the first place. But the papers that I've written with several colleagues have computationally precise definitions as to what constitutes a specific goal. And
that strikes me as though that would necessarily have to be not at the representational level then, right? If you're defining it as a computational process.
What should not be at the representation level? These verbs?
Yeah, like if you're defining verbs as computational processes, then they can't be at the representational level.
That is correct.
Okay.
Yes, and so the reason for choosing these particular words is really to communicate the idea. It's a pragmatic reason. It's to communicate the concept behind the mechanical operation.
I see, the sort of thing that they're likely to represent. with that
Correct.
operation.
Correct.
Okay.
And we will disentangle the representational aspect overtly in the rest of the talk. So I will say, I'm realizing the time, I'm terrible. I have ADHD, y'all. 6:45, we have 15 minutes left. I would love to continue to talk at length about all these ideas, but for the sake of respecting everyone's time, I'm likely only going to be able to talk about the GFI framework overtly if y'all let me just walk through it. But I would
get through your stuff and then we can hang out at the end.
Yes, I will. I would love to do that. Okay, so the imperative goals, how do you accomplish that? Basically, asking that question repeatedly gets you additional imperative goals. So to finish Super Mario Brothers, you have to remove the so-called Bowser token. And you ask the question again, how do you accomplish that? By reaching the location designated as location L1, which is the location of that thing on the right-hand side. Does everyone know what that is? Yeah, you say that very assertively. Yes, the axe. Could it be anything else?
A bunch of pixels.
A bunch of pixels, that's totally fair. It is arguably arranged into a lexicon, and an item of the lexicon would be the Mario Brothers lexicon would be the axe. But we'll come back to this because it surprisingly was a very controversial statement to say that it was an axe. So this on this left-hand side here, to the pictures themselves is the so-called ludological goal hierarchy, which is the hierarchy of goals that the game structurally acknowledges as distinguished states of the game. Now you can ask the question for each one of these goals, what does that mean? So what does that mean? In the case of Mario Brothers, to finish Super Mario Brothers means to save the princess. And this on the right-hand side is what I'm referring to as a narrative goal. The narrative goal is the overt interpretation of a ludological goal. Now, how is it that we get there? How do we get from finish Mario Brothers to save the princess? That is the role of feedback to help us get there. So feedback, broadly speaking, multimodal stimuli intended to convey perceptual information to players. And there are many layers of feedback. At the more sensory level is the phonological feedback, like, for example, the color red or individual sounds. These most directly appeal to the human senses. At a slightly larger layer of abstraction is lexical feedback, which is, in essence, arranging specific phonological items into distinct units that form a lexicon. So for example, words, images, even like haptic vibration patterns on controllers might be part of the lexicon. At an even higher level of abstraction is grammatical feedback, when you are arranging particular lexical items into a kind of grammar or rule set with which to convey information. So for example, in Mario Brothers, levels are structured from left to right, and that gives it implicit meaning. In essence, you know that generally speaking, moving to the right means progress. And actually one of the Mario levels, I think Bowser Castle 4-4, flaunts this overtly by making you choose what trajectory to take. And at some point, if you don't choose correctly, it gets you backwards. So going left to right actually is like decreasing progress. But the only reason that works at the interpretation level is because you have been trained throughout the gameplay to expect progress by going to the right. And then on the far end is denotational feedback, which is arguably the level of feedback that is most closely associated with the narrative of the game, where there is explicit exposition. So in asking the question, how did we get there? We didn't answer it. The reason why I would interpret finish Super Mario Brothers as save the princess is due to the game's packaging. Again, the packaging says, do you have what it takes to save the Mushroom Princess? And arguably, this crafting of feedback to elicit the correct interpretation is what I'm arguing is one of the defining features of narrative design. It's about making sure that players walk away with understanding what the game is about at the ludological level and the narrative level. But be warned, of course, feedback can be ambiguous. So earlier, I asked the question, what is this? In the paper and in the first presentation that I gave about this topic, I actually just said offhandedly, oh yeah, there was actually some disagreement with the other authors that this was an axe. One of the authors saw it as a lever, because in essence, the frame rate of Mario Brothers is so low that it almost looks like the bridge is retracting as opposed to falling. And when I said this, I mean, people just went bonkers. Like, I basically I derailed my own conversation at this conference, because once I said that, everyone just started reacting to it and saying, like, what the heck is the argument for it? Why? And then, getting existential. Ceci n'est pas un axe. But oh yes, it is incredible. But I will ask this in a different sense. What about this? From Space Invaders. What is that thing?
Sure.
Moving gun.
It is a moving gun.
I actually don't know because I've never played Space Invaders, so I just have to trust.
That's totally fair. Zoom, does anyone on Zoom have any questions as to or comments as to what that thing is? So most people will say that it's a spaceship. It's a spaceship. It's like you move it left and right and you shoot upward. According to the Wikipedia article, It's a fixed shooter in which the player controls a laser
Oh my
cannon.
God.
Yeah, no, Chris, you literally the only person who has gotten this right. Most people will just say it is a ship that you are like moving through space. So feedback can be tenuous, and kind of like the lower in the hierarchy that you go, the more tenuous the interpretations can become. Okay, so asking the question, what does that mean for other goals? To remove the token B1, you can maybe more colloquially talk about it as defeating Bowser. To reach that location L1, you can maybe more colloquially discuss it as destroying the bridge. And again, the lower in the hierarchy you go, the more you're kind of relying on people to fill in the blanks as to what they're actually seeing in terms of the actual pixels being displayed in this case. But in the same way that we have a ludological hierarchy being related to each other, we have on the narrative side another kind of relation. So whereas before we read them top down, like how do you accomplish? On the narrative, you read them bottom up. So why do you want to do that? Why do you want to do this? Why do you want to destroy the bridge? Because you want to defeat Bowser. Why do you want to do that? Because you want to save the princess. And so these kind of work in tandem with each other, reinforcing the overall meaning that people walk away with. This is what we defined as the so-called parallel goal hierarchies. On the left-hand side is the ludological goal hierarchy. On the right-hand side is the narrative goal hierarchy. And that concludes what is GFI. Questions so far? Yeah.
You kind of breezed by it. And I'm just going to make an educated, semi-educated guess here. Perceptual information, I'm going to presume, means information that the player is meant to receive rather than information the game is supposed to have for itself.
Correct. So information that is intended to be rendered in a broad sense of that term. So not just like rendered graphically, but also rendered in terms of haptics or rendered in terms of audio.
So it's supposed to be literally perceived by the player as opposed to just running in the background.
Yes, anything that elicits a perceptual response.
Okay.
Mhm.
So in that list of the verbs that you had,
Yeah. The imperatives.
I was just thinking of the example of in Ocarina of Time,
Mhm.
you have to like sneak into Hyrule Castle,
Mhm.
and if you get caught, you lose, right?
Right.
Which verb would that fall under?
Reach.
Reach.
In my mind, it's you have to reach the end location. And then how do you accomplish that? By avoiding, oh, right, thank you. The imperatives, each one has a dual, it's prevention. So avoiding synchronization in space and time with the guards.
Okay, cool, all right.
Yeah, good question. And I love Ocarina of Time, so. All right, so what is GFI hopefully has been answered to some degree. And with 4 minutes left, I'm going to make a plea as to why you need it. Why you need GFI? Because I think you want to avoid this thing referred to as ludo-narrative dissonance. So this term is fairly controversial because it wasn't overtly defined in any way that we could make sense of it when it was first published. It was originally coined by Clint Hawking in trying to describe how he felt in playing the game BioShock. So in BioShock, throughout the game, you are invited to, in essence, accept or reject Ayn Rand's objectivism philosophy through the game's mechanics. So that most directly manifested as you could choose to either harvest or rescue the little sisters that you kept encountering throughout the world of BioShock. Now, at the ending of the game, at the conclusion of the game's experience, there was this little phrase that came up, would you kindly? You discover, and this is effectively a spoiler alert for folks who haven't played BioShock yet, you discover that your companion who is helping you navigate the world is in fact manipulating you, because in essence, he is saying that the phrase, would you kindly, is a kind of trigger phrase to exert absolute control over you as the player. And in essence, repeats back to you. It says like, Andrew Ryan, who is the cooperative NPC in this case, is saying like, stop, would you kindly? Would you kindly? Powerful phrase, familiar phrase, sit, would you kindly? Stand, would you kindly? Run, stop, turn. A man chooses, a slave obeys. Kill, a man chooses, a slave obeys. Obey. And so in essence, this character is exerting absolute control over you, the player. And at the end of the game, the whole choice that you have been presented throughout the game of accepting or rejecting the objectivism philosophy is taken away from you at the very last moment. And so the original description of ludo-narrative dissonance was a conflict between like mechanics and theme. And it's actually deemed a sort of ultimate failure for story games. What I am arguing is that with GFI, you can actually really crisply in our heads, like define or describe what the problem is. In essence, it appeals to the parallel goal hierarchies. So in an abstract sense, ludo-narrative dissonance happens when you have a disconnection of ultimate goals. You can envision the ends, but you cannot access them. So these are, first of all, they're not connected to each other. And finally, they're not even directly like entailable based on your actions. So you can get to the proximate imperative, but you can't get to the last one. And you can envision it, and they're not connected to your overall gameplay. So hopefully that is a very quick argument as to why this framework is so powerful, because I feel like it helps you unpack various aspects, not just ludo-narrative dissonance, but also these additional aspects of narrative design, narrative affordances, narrative utility, and narrative polyvalence. But I am legitimately out of time. It is now 7 p.m. So I will leave you with this cliffhanger, and I'm happy to continue discussing offline. But in essence, let me just give you the punchline up front. I know. Well, as I like that. Okay. Let me also share on Zoom.
I have to know what narrative polyvalence
I
is,
know,
just
I
because it's
know.
such a.
Oh,
just
sure.
Just like show us that slide.
Yes, I
Put it
can.
up while we ask other questions.
Yes, totally. I want to resume sharing. And it says my sharing is paused. Okay, let me go ahead and just reshare very quickly. I don't know. I close Zoom. Oh, there we go. Okay.
You controlling the TV. I thought.
Yes. So, in essence, GFI helps us make sense of this narrative game design space. So what is it? GFI, goals, feedback, interpretation, and framework to unpack story games, why you need it. It helps you disentangle the problems inherent in story game design and how you might use it as a guide to explore narrative affordances, utility, and polyvalence, and more things, other edge cases of the goal hierarchy that we have yet to unpack. Ultimately, the point that I wanted to make with this talk and with this framework is that stories in games are symbiotic, not antagonistic. To study a game is to study its narrative, and to study a narrative in games is to study its gameplay. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks, everyone. This was fun. Okay. I had a request to, let's see. Narrative polyvalence. Okay, so polyvalence, or how to flip the narrative. So this is taken from the game, the Spec Ops: The Line, which plays with a lot of tropes found in most military shooters like Call of Duty and Battlefield. In essence, your character is the canonical hero. You don't question missions as you are tasked with executing them. You don't stop as a character to reflect on what is happening until you do. And so this screenshot is actually the moment where the character in the universe is realizing what has manifested as a consequence of them doing the missions in game. They discover that they, in fact, harmed innocent civilians as opposed to military targets. So the polyvalence part, multiple values of narrative interpretation is ultimately what that means. So what is happening is the ludological hierarchy and the narrative hierarchy are kind of set up for you in tandem, and you kind of interpret what's happening over the course of the game. But then with the careful insertion of feedback, in essence, it's as if you have this additional parallel hierarchy just superimposed, and all of your original goals are remapped onto new meaning.
So,
Ender's Game.
Ender's
Ender's Game.
Ender's Game. That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So I referred to that as coercive ludonarrative resonance.
Ooh, coercive ludonarrative resonance. Okay.
Which is what happens before narrative polyvalence. So in Spec Ops: The Line, you're engaging in a enjoyable shooter. They're making it fun to play, but they're also making your actions dissonant with the story. Like you're a hero, you're a good guy, but you're doing stuff that like you as a player become more and more aware is bad. And like you figure out as a player that something's not right, and you're uncomfortable with the situation, but you're still enjoying doing it.
Right.
And that ludonarrative, intentional, coercive, like I'm
What did you call it? Coercive
ludonarrative resonance. Because the story is that the player is enjoying this. I am being coerced into feeling what the player is feeling, even though I know I should be feeling something else. That builds tension. And then what happens at that moment that the player realizes it, it's remapped, and it releases that tension that it's built up through that point. And that's why Spec Ops: The Line is an utterly brilliant game.
Right. So interestingly, the way that you described it, I would think of resonance as what happens after polyvalence, not before. The reason for it is resonance in my mind means that it is like harmonizing, like one with the other.
It's harmonizing what the player is feeling with what the character is feeling. So the ludonarrative dissonance is Uncharted, where the character is a happy-go-lucky, friendly, nice, quippy guy who murders 10,000 people over the course of the game. That's dissonance. The fact that in Spec Ops: The Line, the character is like a hardened soldier doing his job, and he thinks it's the right thing to do, and you're being made to enjoy doing your job and like align you with the character. It is an uncomfortable alignment. The other one would be God of War. Kratos is murdering the heck out of everyone, and he's being a jerk face, and you feel like he's a jerk face. The gameplay is aligning you with that narrative. It's resonant. I mean, it's coercive because it's making you enjoy being a jerk face. And so that's why it's not dissonant, it's resonant. It's aligning you with the character, but it's coercive because you don't want to be aligned with the character, because the narrative is trying to make you feel something you're uncomfortable with.
I see.
Anyway.
If I can springboard off of that for a second, there was a review of Spec Ops: The Line, which I also haven't played because I did not have that console. But I like watching reviews because I like learning about games. That was discussing how, and this can be a very valuable tool, but it isn't, and this is the case for storytelling with everything, it's not universal, because that effect did not land with the reviewer, because his point was essentially, and this stuck with me as a writer, knowing that I want to evoke certain emotions, it's hard to feel guilty about something that the game told you to do.
And that you had no other choice to do.
Yeah.
This is my problem with
conflict.
this is my problem with all of these games that do this. Is it's like, well, you're not giving the player any other choice. It's just like you're pointing and laughing and saying,
This
you
is
did a thing that you feel guilty
this
about.
is a huge
Question
criticism.
them.
That's a huge criticism of Last of Us 2, I think, when that game came out. That
Yeah, I mean,
unlike Spec Ops: The Line or what's the other game?
I think it's a God of War.
Oh no,
Uncharted.
no. Well, no. Unlike Spec Ops: The Line, you don't really you don't get you don't have a choice ever. You just go straight into the end of the game. I think another example is Braid. Now that I think about it, where it's at the end you find out that
I don't think I understood the story of Braid.
I think it's at the end you find out that the character you've been playing as was basically the villain the whole time, and the princess was trying to stay away from you.
Braid is either about
So-
a man stalking a princess and reframing it as him rescuing her,
Yeah.
or it's about the development of the atomic bomb, depending on how far into unlocking. I have played Braid.
So in chat, Jasmine Otto has mentioned that Spec Ops is usually unusually good about letting you choose not to. Not in the napalm sequence that was depicted earlier, but when you're asked to fire into a crowd, before that you can actually fire over their heads.
Interesting. And is it how like obvious is it that you have that choice?
That's a good question. The question is, how obvious is it that you have that choice? I would venture to guess that it's not obvious at all.
There's
Not obvious.
There's another
Jasmine
sequence in the
agrees.
first 3 minutes of the game where you come upon someone that you've wounded and you can't have killed them. And when you walk up to them, it says like press F to kill, and you stomp on their neck, and it's super upsetting. Like, you don't have to do that. You can just keep going.
Mhm.
But the game
The game
presents it to you, and most players, especially those of first-person shooters who
Well,
were the
it's-
target audience
It's
here.
using the because it's using the language.
Just
as Rogelio
do
said,
it.
it's using the language of the game to
Yeah,
suggest that you
right.
have
And that's,
Absolutely.
that's the choice, is like, did you question that? Not did you do it or not,
Mhm.
but like, if you uncritically did these things, then you're
Mhm.
culpable for not questioning it.
Mhm.
Or
And
unlike,
that's why I thought the game was.
unlike these games that have little.
Thanks, Sasha.
Just kind of like, I kind of see that as like, almost that like the game is not playing by, oh, what's the,
It's transgressing.
no, but, sorry, I'm fishing for a term, by the Garcian maxim
Oh yeah.
of,
Mhm.
of like.
Conversation.
Conversation, right? Like, and this goes, Rogelio has worked on games as conversation that I think this idea fits in well too, but that like, when you're having a conversation, it's like there are certain principles that like, you assume that your conversationalist, at least if they're, a friendly person and not being an adversary to you, like, is going to, assume that when they say certain things, you're going to like make the most obvious like guess about where what that thing means. And likewise, I get like the way you framed this was linguistic, right? The
Mhm.
games are giving you sentences in a language
That's right.
that you learn through game, like by you develop game literacy to
Mhm.
try to understand, to understand that when a game tells you it, when a game puts an instruction on the screen, that's usually like you have to do that in order to progress.
It's a
Mhm.
directive,
And
not
so-
a suggestion.
Right, and
Yeah.
so because it's using that language to you, and if you are a person who plays games and you're like assuming that there's sort of Gricean like collegiality between you and the game,
Mhm.
then you wouldn't question it, right?
Right.
Mhm.
Did you define collegiality?
It's the notion of cooperativity.
Right,
Got it.
yeah.
Right. So we are cooperating in conversation. And we are relying on a bunch of assumptions that are not overtly stated, but that actually facilitate a lot. So for example, if you ask me for a letter of recommendation and I say, oh, they have great penmanship, and I'm recommending you for like a research position, then that says something about what I think of your research skills, because I'm by omission, right?
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I was also thinking on a more ground-based level.
I'll take
It's
mine.
those
Okay.
assumptions built in where it's like, you say something to me like.
Did you want the
"How many
book?"
questions?"
Mhm.
I'm not supposed to say back, potato kumquat, that's not an.
Right. Right. So the example of that I kind of rely on is there's this scene in in the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, where as you get close to this cliff,
Oh my
you
God,
get the
one
prompt,
example.
the Bard's Leap summit has been discovered, right? And the content of that prompt and the timing of that prompt and what that prompt has usually signified in the game prior to that point, right? So usually you get that prompt when you enter a city. It's a place of significance that invites the player to do something they would normally do, which is literally jump. It's
Which was immediately what I wanted.
right. It's the only place in Skyrim that you can jump off and not get hurt on the fall, and you encounter narrative content that you can only access after doing that jump. So if you get to the base of the jump and you don't actually do the jump, you don't get this prompt, this exchange.
So the thing about the Skyrim example and the Spec Ops: The Line example, I think, are both. I haven't played Spec Ops: The Line, so I don't know if that example you gave about the crowd.
Mhm.
If there's a point earlier in the game where you have no choice but to shoot into a crowd. Because what I'm thinking about is that like with these two games, what they're doing right now is they're playing with like a cultural understanding of games, right? Like you jump off a point that's too high, you're gonna hurt yourself. You see a prompt that tells you to do a thing, you should click it in order to proceed, right? But I guess the question is like, is there any point prior in the game where you absolutely have to do the thing to proceed?
Like, did it establish the rules it was playing by and then break them?
And then break them.
Or was it consistent about the rules it was playing by the whole time?
Yeah. Because in the case of Skyrim, that fall is fine because you landed in water. And if you were to jump off of another party and land in water, you'll be fine.
Not true.
That's not true?
No.
Oh, then
Because
Someone who tested it.
oh yes, I mean it's literally the game of my dissertation. So
I remember those examples from your dissertation.
yeah, so there are other places where you can jump into pools and take damage. And further, there are no other place in Skyrim has narrative content that succeeds the action of jumping off a cliff.
I would say that the difference here is that Skyrim wants you to do the thing and wants to signal to you that you can do the thing.
Without telling you to do the thing.
Without telling you, well, I mean, without overtly telling
Yeah,
you to do the
that's
thing.
what I mean, yeah.
But they want you to feel clever for figuring it out.
Yes.
So the reason they're not telling you is not to trick you into jumping off. Like if you jumped off and died, then that would be coercive. But the game is on your side, right? In Spec Ops: The Line, the game is making a rhetorical argument, and the game is not trying to be fair, right? Like there's no presumption that you and the game are on the same side. The game is trying to catch you, first-person shooter player who enjoys playing first-person shooters, and set you up a trap so that when you get to that point, you feel like crap and question the fact that you've been uncritically engaging with murder simulation, and that you should think about that a little bit. It's not about the character recognizing that they're schizophrenic and they've had a break with reality and things aren't what they seem. It's about you as the player at that moment going, maybe this thing that I enjoy doing has some problematic elements. It's not to say you should stop playing first-person shooters, but it forces you rhetorically to confront that, and it doesn't care if that's fair.
Yeah.
As Jasmine Otto was saying on Zoom chat, Spec Ops also wants you to feel clever for realizing that you can minimize damage when you realize you don't have to shoot into the crowd.
Right. Yeah. In which case, I would say Spec Ops: The Line is actually like I'm trying to get at like the I guess like mechanics here, right? The mechanics of the game where like I feel like Skyrim cheated, whereas Spec Ops: The Line didn't.
Well, Skyrim gave you, in the GFI framework, Skyrim gave you enough for you to envision a narrative goal without telling you the ludological counterpower. And so like you in essence can fill in the blank and say, oh, that's what I have to actually do. And it's a direct call for you to do it.
Except that ludological counterpart is inconsistent with all of the like Luis was pointing out, it's like it's inconsistent with the previous ludological inferences that you made.
Oh,
So, and the reason why I find this interesting is because like in the game that I love, Dark Souls 3 specifically, in the final DLC for Dark Souls 3, there's a huge part of the level involves hopping off of cliffs like this and landing right into like snow piles effectively. And at no point before in the game has there ever been that being like nowhere has that been okay. And they had to give you a specific prompt saying it's going to be okay.
Right, because people wouldn't try it.
Yeah, exactly. And this was criticized actually as a
There's a
design.
history of games having this sort of I don't know what the right word is, but like violation of rules, breaking of the fourth wall, metacognition required to understand. The PlayStation demo PT, which was a fantastic horror experience that you can't play anymore. But you get to a certain point in that, and there's a picture where there's someone whose face has been crossed out, but weirdly like in blue, like there's a blue X on it, not. And what you have to notice is that on your controller, the X is blue.
Yeah.
And if you press the X, which is not used elsewhere anywhere in the game, you press that button and your character like breaks through that and then the puzzle advances and you can't advance in the game beyond that. And like, there's no scaffolding for that being
Yeah.
a thing, other than that being like the developer's signature of breaking the fourth wall in that way.
That kind of reminds me a little bit of, this is a much smaller example. There's a game called Year Walk, which is a small, I don't want to say narrative, it's an atmospheric little walk around game where you basically lead a man to his chosen doom. Spoiler alert. And at one point you have to solve a puzzle where, how in detail do I want to get here? It deals in.
It sounds interesting enough, I might want to play it, so try not to spoil it.
Oh, I mean,
You're welcome.
you have to collect 4 MacGuffins to stay as unspoilery as possible. And it comes in several different formats, but to avoid, let me do this fairly. What format would you most likely play the game in? It's on Switch.
It's on Switch, I'll play it on Switch.
Okay, then I'm gonna use the Mac version.
Okay.
In the Mac version, there is a locked door, and there is an L on the top and an R on the bottom. And you have to basically use the WASD and your mouse. This is telling you, and it took me a while to work this out, to use both the L and the R key to open the lock, which had not been used in the game before and were not used after. So it's one of the, but the thing is, the game breaks the rules like that all the time.
Right.
But I don't see that as breaking the rules. I see that as adding things to your
So-
vocabulary.
It is, but it
Yeah.
never comes up again. is the-
I mean,
I
if
see,
there
so
were,
it's like a one-off thing. It doesn't, it's not like it's building on that vocabulary and then you reuse it. I mean, and I
But
think like that's
every
okay.
puzzle is like that, so
Okay,
it's like
sure.
the whole game.
Yeah.
The format of the game is you have stepped out of the confines of your reality, so some in-universe rule breaking,
I see.
as out-of-universe rule breaking makes sense.
Right.
And let me tell you, it gets really creepy, which it should be.
Okay.
It is a horror game.
Sure.
It's
Okay.
an atmospheric horror game with 2 jump scares.
Yeah, I mean, and I think this is maybe just like, this maybe goes back to just, kind of the concept of game aesthetics and sort of, dimensions of player experience, where I think there are interesting things like that can evoke in people, but I'm, for me personally, I'm more interested in the sorts of things where like the vocabulary of the game is established and you spend your gameplay kind of exploring the emergent consequences of that vocabulary, and maybe adding things to it, but where nothing is ever like inconsistent or completely just like a throwaway one-off, like part of the thing that you have
If I
to do.
could jump off of that for a second, I thought of a more consistent example with what you're talking about, which oddly enough is Hitman. I've
Okay.
been playing Hitman 2016 lately because I don't know any hobbies, but it's a good game. It was on sale, and I've been playing Hitman 2016, and the interesting thing is, obviously, you are playing a Hitman. Your intent is to kill, but you can still choose at every point to the extent at which you do that. You can be either a mass murderer and drop a giant chandelier on top of an entire fashion show. Guess what I picked? Or you can subtly poison someone and then sneak them out, and they don't even know they're dead until you're gone. So obviously there is no morally good choice, but there are perhaps ethically cleaner choices. Or I don't want to say good because you're killing someone. More efficient with less
Gore.
gore.
Less
I'm not a
extraneous.
murderer. Let me make it
Yeah,
clear.
yeah.
So I will wrap us up, and I will fully take the credit of seeing this discussion emerge from the GFI framework as evidence that it's useful. So feel free to discuss or
This is the mark of a successful talk.
yep, thanks. Yeah, thank y'all so much for having me. Thank y'all on Zoom. Great. I'll see y'all around.
Are you Professor?
I am responding.
Hi, I'm Lara Lewis. I'm the
Oh,
one
hi.
Leanne introduced.
Nice to
Nice
meet
to
you.
meet you. I'm looking forward to the summer. I'm
Yeah,
really
it's really
excited.
good.
yeah.
This was a wonderful conversation. I really good to break the ice.
Thanks.
Are you doing research?
thing.
All right, signing off Zoom. Good to see everybody.
Drove
Bye.
me to write a book